Welcome to the Lectures in History podcast, where we bring the classroom to you, featuring lectures from some of the nation's top professors. This week, we're exploring Latino migration. Duke University professor Cecilia Marquez guides us through the 20th and 21st centuries, highlighting the migration trends that shaped American culture, transformed communities, and powered economic development. Professor Marquez is the author of a recent book, Making the Latino South, which challenges the commonly held beliefs about the origins of Latino identity and the power of region in shaping race. More after this.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike Big Wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hi, everyone. We've been talking a little bit in class about this idea about placemakers and making place and making community. And we've talked about a few places. We've talked about California. We've talked a little bit about Miami, a little about New York. And so today we're going to think about the South. A lot of the work that we're doing in our class is about the history of Latinos in the South and the work that we're doing about the history of Latinos here in Durham. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's what our reading was about today, the sort of more recent history of Latinos in the South. So what are we going to do today? We're going to review some of what we've already learned, remind ourselves what we knew about the history of Latinos in the South prior to the 1970s and 80s. We're going to talk about how and why Latinos arrive in the South. That's something really important I want us to understand by the end of today. We've talked a lot about migration and how and why you migrate shapes what that means for what you experience. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means for the South. And then we'll end by talking about Latinos as placemakers here in the Southeast. So as we get started, can someone remind me a little bit about what we've already learned about Latinos in the South prior to the 1970s? What did we learn when we read a little bit of Corazón de Dixie by Julie Wise, or from the exhibit about the history of Latinos at Duke? What was life like for Latinos prior to the 1970s? Yes, Maria.
We learned mostly about Cuban migration from Cuba to Florida, and the different waves of migration that happened with the Cuban Revolution specifically. That's the main demographic I could think of.
Yeah, so we learned when we read Ybor City, we talked a little bit about Latino migration to Tampa and the cigar industry and their experience there. Any other thoughts about sort of from the exhibit and the Julie Wise readings? Yeah.
A lot of upper class Latinos from Latin America would come to educational institutions here, and they're usually whiter and would kind of fit within the black and white binary, but also not really.
Yes, okay, good. Yeah, Melanie. Oh, wait for that. Yeah, here we go. Melanie.
I think it was also trying to assimilate to white America and trying to fit into what Jessica said about the white and black binary standards of what America had, because the Latino identity is so diverse and so complex that I think that society was still not subjected to understand that. So, yeah.
Right. So the populations in the South prior to the 1970s were still pretty small. We didn't have kind of large-scale migration the way we did in places like LA or Miami or New York, right? So there wasn't a real sense of Latino as a category. So when we looked at places like Duke University, we had since the 1910s, there have been Latinos attending Duke University, specifically non-Black Latinos attending Duke University. And we talked a little bit about this in relation to this category of provisional whiteness. So when I talk about that category, when we think about early Latinos in the South, specifically in the Jim Crow era, what I'm sort of thinking about is how Latinos both, sort of as Jessica got us thinking about it, how they both fit into and didn't fit into whiteness, how they were able to attend a school like Duke University, which was segregated under Jim Crow, but they also didn't like fully fit in. So for an example, we have one here. So this is a letter from between the director of graduate admissions at Duke and one of the deans. So 1943, Juan Rivera applies to Duke University, and you'll see here the assistant dean, they're trying to sort of figure out, can he attend Duke? Like, we're still in Jim Crow, what's going on? How do we figure this out? You can see here, he writes, when it comes to the man and his color, I do not know whether or not he is white. You can obviously see, he continues, that he is not entirely so. His skin is dark. However, Roberts notes, sometimes their type has been accepted in the South as dark Spaniards. Despite what they describe as his dark skin and lively hair, he's able to attend Duke and is admitted. So this kind of gets at the sense of they're admitted to Duke, they're attending this all-white institution, and yet they're still experiencing forms of discrimination and exclusion. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine a letter like this being in an admissions file today. You know, like this is what admissions partly looked like, as they were trying to figure out, like, is this person racially qualified to attend this school? So just to sort of like recap, right? This moment prior to the 1970s really is a time when Latinos aren't being defined in a really clear way, right? They're like someone like Juan Rivera, where it's like, you're not quite white, we need to figure out what you are, but you can still attend this school. They're sort of figuring it out. There isn't this kind of cohesive identity yet. So let's talk a little bit about, before we sort of land into where we're talking about today, what was happening in other places. So we've gone through Miami, New York, Los Angeles, right? What was happening there in the 1960s and 1970s? How might that look different than these stories? You can think a little bit about the reading that we did, like what was going on, for example, in LA when we read about becoming Mexican American and the repatriation moment. Yeah, Maria.
They were mostly being brought under the Bracero program, so it was mostly like lower income Mexican/Mexican Americans like coming here for work, especially like agricultural work, as opposed to like education.
Yeah. So one of the things that brings a lot of Mexicans to the Southwest and to the West is the Bracero program, right? That the labor program where they could get labor contracts to go to California, to go to Texas, places like that. So there's these big labor migrations happening in places like California. There's a lot more Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And there's a sense of kind of community and identity that we talked about forming there in the 1940s and 50s. We also talked about the Chicano movement a little bit and how in the 1960s and 1970s, well, so can someone here tell me, what did we learn about the Chicano movement? What are some of the key takeaways that you all had about that movement and that moment in history?
What most stuck out for me was the protests in East LA and how Chicano students, well, because of high dropout rates or low test scores or low graduation rates, Chicanos sort of came together to protest the lack of Latino personnel, the lack of Latino staff, the lack of bilingual education, the lack of inclusive bilingual education. So that was the sort of like educational sector of the Chicano movement.
Yeah, what about Chicano nationalism? Can someone remind me what that was? Yeah, Jackie.
It was basically this like collective identity of them not being white, but also not being black. It was this sort of, we are this combination, we are one, we are united, we're basically one race.
Good.
And so that kind of also caused people to be excluded or have to deny a certain part of their identity. But it was very much focused on their indigeneity and how they were the original ones here, and to take that back, basically.
Good. So part of what I'm, oh, sorry, please, yes, go ahead, Ruby. Please add to that.
I just wanted to add to Jackie's point, because we also spoke about how in their trying to assimilate with whiteness and their rejection of white people, but also their rejection of the black identity, it also turns into like this fetishization of indigeneity, and we also spoke about that with the movement as well.
Yeah, great. So part of what I'm trying to help us get at as we like try to land ourselves in the 1980s and 1990s here in the Southeast is that in a lot of these different places, in Los Angeles, we have throughout California, Chicano activism, throughout the West and Southwest, frankly. There's a growing sense of kind of racial identity, a sense that they are part of this growing activism, civil rights movement, all of these different things. There's a sense of a kind of emergent Latino or Chicano or Boricua identity forming in places like New York with the Young Lords who we learned about. And even in Miami, it may not have been as progressive in identity, but it was still a racial identity that emerges after we get the sort of first waves of Cuban migration. So that's kind of what's happening in the rest of the country, which is a way to kind of juxtapose what we're going to learn about a little bit here in the South. So why do we want to talk about the South, right? I mean, this feels maybe not as, I don't know, this isn't as important for you all sitting here in North Carolina, understanding that this is a place that we should care about studying Latinos in general. But just to give you a sense of sort of why this matters so much, why it's important to understand Latino history outside of California, outside of New York. Between the 1990s and the 2000s, the fastest growing Latino populations, most of them are below the Mason-Dixon line, right? The South becomes the kind of the new destination for huge numbers of Latino immigrants in this time period. Here in North Carolina, for example, we can see the kind of rapid growth and the sort of projected continued growth. Just to give you a sense of like why it's important to understand the history is partly so that we can understand how we get to this moment. Why do we have Latino migration? How do people end up here? The other thing that we can see here on these sort of more recent census bureaus, we can see that the population over time is sort of diversifying. It's mostly Mexican, but it's becoming increasingly Central American. We also can see at the 2021, 34% are born in North Carolina, right? One of the things I'm hoping that you take away from our class today is that we talk a lot about Latinos as perpetually new, perpetually foreign, perpetually newcomers. And I think nowhere is that more acute than here in the South. There's a sense that Latinos are like just arriving. We just got here yesterday, right? And increasingly, people are having their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids here in North Carolina and places throughout the Southeast. So it's important to understand that we have sort of an extended history here in the region. Okay, any questions about that before I sort of land us in 1980 and get us back into this moment to explain why we end up here? Okay, cool. So why the 1980s and 1990s? There's a bunch of things that happen in the 1980s that lead to the large-scale migration of Latinos to the Southeast. So the first are changes in federal immigration policy. So the first is the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which starts in 1986, which is signed into law in 1986 by Ronald Reagan. One of the things it does is it normalizes the status of approximately 3 million undocumented people in the United States. I know that's like a surprise twist from Ronald Reagan, but it happened. And so he normalizes the status of 3 million undocumented Americans, and he also makes it much harder to cross the border. So there's an offer of amnesty, but there's also an increased militarization of the border. They hire more border patrols. They make the border more difficult to cross, right? So why does that matter? A couple things. One, when they normalized the statuses of tons of people, they were able to move for the first time, really. A lot of undocumented people who were living in places like Chicago or LA or New York, they had a sort of sense of community and a sense that they were safe, right? That there were certain employers, certain places they could live, that they knew wouldn't check papers, that they had a real sort of sense of community there. This finally let them move where they wanted to go, potentially. They had papers all of a sudden. They could go buy a home somewhere else. They could do things they couldn't do before. A lot of them chose to move to the Southeast, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, but one of the reasons is really a search for a calmer life. A lot of the people who I spoke to, a lot of the people that we read about, talked about the fact that they came from rural Mexico or they came from rural Central America. And they were like, LA is like cool and all, but like I would like to be able to have a goat and a little bit of land, you know? Like they were like, I just want it to be calmer, that this is actually, I'm not like a city girl. Like, how do I get out of here? And so, not city girl, like that kind of city girl, like not like the rappers, like a you know what I'm saying, an urban person. So they wanted to live in a more rural place. They wanted to be able to buy a house, to raise their kids in what felt like a safe place and in a community that felt more like what they were experiencing when they were sort of in other places. So the important thing that happens, though, with this sort of militarization of the border, the increased sort of security of it, is it makes it harder for people to engage in circular migration. So prior to this, well, let me ask, does anyone know what I mean when I say circular migration? Have you learned this in other classes? We haven't talked a lot about it here. Does that mean anything to anyone? Jess, you want to answer?
Yeah. Well, Puerto Ricans have a circular migration pattern. It basically just means that you like move to a place and maybe you have the intention of returning. And even when people don't, they like continue to return back to the country that they came from.
Right, and for Puerto Ricans, that's a lot easier because they have citizenship, right? But there's a similar pattern that's also true with Mexicans, right? The Mexicans will come for a picking season or they'll come for a few months, and then the plan is always to go back to Mexico, and they often do. They would come for a few months, live in the US, make money, and return back to their families. However, once the border gets more militarized, those crossings become more difficult. And so people who had traditionally come for a few months, done a little bit of work, gone back home, all of a sudden say, we have to make a decision. Like, we have to sort of lay roots somewhere, or else this becomes more dangerous and more expensive every time to cross. And so increasingly, people who had engaged in that decide to land more permanently in the US, and many of them choose to land in the South. The other thing that happens is IRA in 1996, passed under Bill Clinton. I can never remember what the whole thing stands for. It's like Illegal Immigration Reform and IRA. Immigrant Responsibility Act. Thank you, Ruby. We appreciate you. Whenever you hear the word responsibility, you're like, what's that in a law? I'm always like, uh-oh, this sounds like it's going to be an issue. So 1996, that's passed. And one of the things it does is it creates the 287G programs. Does anyone here know what a 287G program is? Okay. So a 287G program, I'll circle back to it a little bit in the 9/11 when we get to that moment. But 287G makes it possible for local police officials to collaborate with ICE, Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement. So what does that mean? It means that if you normally were going to get pulled over and you had a broken taillight, traditionally, the police would give you a ticket and say, sorry, you're having a bad day, best wishes. Now what that meant is that they could work alongside ICE to begin detention and deportation proceedings. So if they suspect for any reason that you were undocumented, they have that authority all of a sudden. That's like a new thing that they have. So these don't really pick up steam until for a few years, but it's an important moment for us to sort of note. And IRA also continues to make it harder and harder for people to cross the border, further cementing that kind of permanent status here in the US. At the same time that all of this is happening, there's economic decline in Mexico because of a lot of reasons. I don't have really time to sort of go into the depth of them. But it's also pushing more and more people north, both to northern Mexico and then eventually to the US. At the same time that all of this is happening, so we have changes in federal immigration law that make it harder for people to engage in circular migration. We have the desire by Latinos to have a calmer life. And we have economic decline in Mexico. So these are all these kinds of factors that are coming together. The other thing we have is the active recruitment by Southern companies of Latinos. So in this time period, the Sun Belt, which you can sort of think of as going from sort of like the bottom half of the US and like sort of all of that area, both from the east to the west coast, the Sun Belt is really expanding. And that's both manufacturing and food processing, all of these different things. The industry is sort of is expanding in the South at the same time that in other parts of the country, it's really contracting. So if you think about like, I don't know, the auto industry in Detroit, that's really contracting. But here in the South, things like the carpet industry, the furniture industry, the construction industry, food processing industry, those are all growing at this moment. So we're having this kind of massive growth at the same time that Latinos are showing up at the South, which is not a coincidence. So I just want to give sort of a few examples of how the Southern industry actively recruited Latinos to the region. And this is, I'm just going to like put a little pin in this because I just want to sort of flag it for us. Like, this active recruitment is important, right? Because again, we often are like, why do Latinos end up in these like unexpected places? And there's usually a story like this behind it. Okay, starting as early as 1977, Mississippi-based poultry company BC Rogers Poultry began to recruit Mexican migrants from El Paso, Texas. Later, the same BC Rogers company formed what they called the Hispanic Project. From 1994 to 1998, they attempted to recruit Latinos from Miami to come work in poultry processing plants. In Charlotte, North Carolina, truckloads of Mexican men were recruited and brought on by Texan subcontractors. So basically, these Texan subcontractors, the companies are like, we want Latinos. And so they go to Texas and hire subcontractors to bring them Latinos, right? They're actively going to find Latino workers. They're going to places like Miami, and they're going to places like Texas to be able to try and find them. Companies also created incentive programs created by the companies to help aid recruitment. Latino workers would receive a bonus for each additional worker that they brought on, and an extra bonus if they stayed. So like if you got a job at a poultry plant and you brought your cousin and your cousin's girlfriend and they stayed, you get a bonus. So they're creating this kind of chain migration, right? Yeah, Alexa.
What was their incentive for doing this?
The incentive of
recruiting Latinos to work like for their companies.
why do you think they would do that?
The only thing I could think of is like if they were specifically targeting undocumented people so that they can pay them less and under the books. Is that
That's
why?
part of the story. That's definitely part of the story. Yeah, Sebastian.
What was their wage in comparison to the cost of living back then?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is about wages and how are they compared? So it depended on what field you were in and what industry you were in. Agriculture, for example, they were often dramatically underpaid, but in places like, in other places, they would sometimes have closer to equal pay, but the hours would be much worse, and the protections would be much worse, and the labor would be much worse. So it really varied based on the industry and sometimes the specific factory or job or company that you worked with. But once it's more and more undocumented workers, you start to see those wages go down pretty dramatically. So yes, to your point, Alexa, in part it's about, there's two things happening at the same time. One, the industries are expanding rapidly, and they argue that they're having a labor shortage. Now this, I think, is a kind of thing we can be curious about, right? What is a labor shortage? Is a labor shortage a lack of labor, or a lack of people willing to do labor at the price that you've set it at, right? So if you tell me that you're gonna pay me $100,000 to work in a poultry industry, I don't think you'll have a poultry industry labor shortage, right? And so then the question is, where is this labor shortage coming from? So there's that they needed, in their argument, they needed workers, and that there just weren't enough workers. And I think in some cases that is true, that in some cases we're talking about really rural parts of North Carolina and Georgia, and all of a sudden they have these huge poultry factories that are expanding really quickly, and they just don't have enough bodies to do the work. Other times I think it's a strategic move. But yeah, there is this kind of sense too, as the South becomes more and more part of the Sun Belt, that Latinos are good workers. There's this idea, I think, that you look at California, you look at Texas, and this idea that Latinos are so central to that workforce. There's a desire, I think, on their part to experiment with what they see as reliable and cheap labor, fundamentally.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit Shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Any other questions about that? Okay. So they created these incentive programs to bring people on. As late as 2002, Gold Kist, an Alabama poultry manufacturer, had installed billboards in Mexico that read "Mucho trabajo in Russellville, Alabama." There's plenty of work here in Alabama. They also bought radio ads in Spanish in Mexico to entice the new workers. So what I'm trying to get at here is that Latinos don't wander into rural North Carolina. There's some desire around sort of like a calmer life, but they're actively recruited, right? There's an active sort of marketing system to bring this labor here to the South. So what happens when Latinos get here to the South? What happens? To answer this, we're going to talk a little bit about Dalton, which you read about for today. So what's the deal with Dalton, now that you all know so much about carpets, probably? Or what do you know about Dalton, Georgia now, and what that place was? Or I guess is, it still exists. Yeah, Jackie.
Well, at first it was like they were very much welcomed because there was this need for cheap labor, and so they saw them as like helping the industry. But you see that later change after 9/11, where they're then being harassed. There's hate crimes against them, and there's like these anti-immigrant incentives that happen to get aliens out of the country.
Good. Yes. Anyone else want to add to that? Okay, good. So just to land us in Dalton, Dalton is the carpet capital of the world in the 1990s, a flex that none of you thought existed but did. It's where like roughly 2/3 of all carpet was made for the United States in the 1990s. And so one of the things that happens in Dalton, and it's not just in Dalton, it's in other parts of the South too, is that that Latinos who are arriving to basically save or build or grow these industries are seen as, I don't know, like a gift. They're seen as a gift to these communities, and they're welcomed in a lot of ways. So just a few quotes to give you a sense of what people were thinking about here in Dalton. I love my Mexicans. So that was like a tough first line. I should have like given you a bit more of a warm up, but here we are. I love my Mexicans, said Durkin Spinning Mill manager Sonny Buchanan. They go out there and run their jobs. They're loyal. The white people are just the opposite. They bounce around. These Hispanics are helping us out. One employer celebrated the Hispanic work ethic by saying, quote, Hispanic employees work harder and produce more. They are just fantastic workers. They don't call in sick, he went on, and when they come, they really work. Hispanic workers, he noted, work twice as hard as Americans for the same wages. Latinos were praised as the lifeblood of this industry and this community, and a godsend for many struggling industries. In Dalton, the Chamber of Commerce president, George Woodward, said, quote, thank goodness that when we needed to fill these jobs, we had people to come in to keep the carpet investments here. In general, he continued, these are people with strong family values, red, white, and blue values. This, of course, stands in stark contrast to the language used by advocates in California, for example. So, I mean, if we're in the 1990s here in Dalton, Georgia, that's the same time that like California is doing Prop 187. Prop 187, for those who don't know, was at the time the kind of harshest state-level anti-immigration legislation that was basically trying to make it impossible to be undocumented in California. And so, you know, in California they're doing that, and in Georgia, there's this kind of complicated welcome. This here is an image of Erwin Mitchell. He was a state senator in Georgia, and he helped organize and found the Georgia Project, which was a bilingual education program that they created in the Georgia schools. And it brought, you read a little bit about this today, but they brought teachers from Monterrey to come work in the schools. I just find that like a very striking image, striking the word I'm looking for. So we talked a little bit about this with Dalton, but in other, we didn't read this for today, but Julie Wise, who we've read some of her work earlier, writes about pro-immigrant conservatism in Georgia, and her argument is something like, I'm sort of giving it a gloss here, in places like Georgia, people who were conservatives were actually very pro-immigrant. There was a real sense that they needed this labor, that immigrants were an important part of the workforce. And so even people who we might think of as traditionally anti-immigrant were pro-immigrant in this moment. So this idea of pro-immigrant conservatism. Latinos also take on this language of hardworking themselves, which I think is important to know, that it isn't just white Daltonians describing them this way. So in June of 1999, Rafael Carballo wrote an op-ed in one of Dalton, Georgia's Spanish language newspapers. He wrote, the whole of the Dalton community has to confront the reality that Dalton's demographics have changed. It has been the Hispanic community that kept the manufacturing and agricultural industries on their feet in Dalton. It's a fact that without the labor of Hispanics, the economies of Dalton and Whitfield would have hit rock bottom. So people are talking about Latinos as a godsend to this community, and Latinos are taking that on, right? They're saying, you're welcome. You know what I mean? Like many Latinos are being like, you're welcome for the labor. We did save you. And as a result, we need to be treated better and differently, right? And we can think about, we've been very critical about the complicated nature of, the complicated arguments that activists make. This is an argument that a lot of people are making, that we were central and vital to your economy. So you have to take us seriously and you have to treat us with respect. So as the Latino population continues to grow in places like Dalton, communities begin to emerge. So can someone remind me, we read a little bit about this idea about placemakers in California when we were reading the piece about the Nayarit, the restaurant. Can someone remind me, what are placemakers? What is that? What does Natalia Molina mean when she says a placemaker? What is that category? Yeah, Julissa.
Well, when I think of placemakers, I think of like hubs of just like Latino life and how there are certain places that may not be like in the history books, but are places where Latinos were able to go and be in community and feel like, you know, like they were, I guess, like welcomed here. So like when we talked about it in Nayarit, we talked about how it wasn't so well known, but it was well known to the Latinos in that community.
Great. Does anyone want to add to that? About that? Sorry, were you raising your hand? Okay. So yes, I want to just add a little bit to what Julissa said. So part of it is that it was a placemaker is sort of creating a space that Latinos could feel at home, right? It was a place that they could get a sense of community, build different sort of community organizations and things like that, and restaurants and other sites become important in that story. The other sort of part of her argument, right, is that they also make the place by being there. That in addition to creating places for Latino communities, they also transform the community that they're a part of. So when we're talking about Dalton, we can see, these are just a few images here. Up there is a restaurant called Guadalajara. This is from an image from El Centro Latino. And then, fun fact, the Dalton, Georgia's soccer team won like the state championship like a bunch of years in a row. And it's this very interesting, anyway, it's like an interesting thing because now Dalton's non-Latino community has really rallied around this soccer team, and it's a lovely New York Times article if anyone wants to read it, but that's Dalton's soccer team, mostly Latinos. Okay, so 1990s, Latinos are filtering into Dalton in really, really big numbers. And this is not just a story in Dalton. It's happening in places like here in Durham, North Carolina. It's happening throughout North Carolina, a lot of places like in Mississippi, Alabama, basically anywhere that had poultry processing, manufacturing, construction, a lot of those kinds of different industries that were actively seeking out these groups. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of these folks. So Joana Sandoval was one of the many Latinos who moved to Dalton in the 1980s. She was born to Mexican parents in the United States, and she grew up in Michigan and came to Dalton after graduating from college in the 1980s. She wasn't able to find work despite her ability to speak both English and Spanish fluently and her college education. She felt that she was blocked from these jobs because she was Latino. When she arrived in the 1980s, she was only part of a small community of Latinos, maybe about 100, and most of them were poor, few spoke English, and many were undocumented. Seeing the members of the community who needed service, she partnered with the local church to help residents with immigration paperwork. The group continued to grow and began to teach English classes. They eventually outgrew the church that they started in, and she partnered with Latino business leaders in the area to create Centro Latino, which is the group that sponsored this, the dance, I don't know what the word is, dance show. So they organized they offered English and Spanish classes, citizenship classes. They helped people with taxes, with legal assistance. They helped with legal documents and driver's licenses and housing assistance. They also organized dance festivals and poetry contests and the Copa Centro Latino soccer tournament. So 10 years after it's founded, it was helping about 900 people a month. So what I think is important about that story and sort of thinking about what they contributed to Dalton is thinking about the role that Latinos played beyond just their labor, right? That it's not just about the work that they did in carpet factories or in poultry factories, but that they were actively transforming Dalton in the process with these kinds of cultural institutions, restaurants and things like that. Okay, so this is kind of the 1990s. This is like the hardworking the moment of the kind of creation of the hardworking Latino immigrant. I'm going to sort of transition us a little bit to the 2000s, but before I go there, any other sort of reflections about this, about what this category means, about this hardworking Hispanic immigrant and how it ties to other things? Yeah.
Of Hispanics in like Dalton or other areas was like cyclical in like the demand, because a lot of the praise that I've been hearing from you about the from like the white community or other people who lived in there was basically just that they were hard workers and that they contributed a lot to like the economy. But like if let's say there was a recession and there wasn't as much like demand for jobs, wouldn't they be treated like much more poorly in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, spoiler alert for what happens in 2008. Yeah, yes, 100%. I mean, but yes, I mean, there is a kind of cyclical nature to this story, not just in Dalton, but in general, right? The kind of constant welcome and expulsion of Latinos, right? We welcome you, please come do work, thank you so much, we appreciate you, get out, right? Like that's a cycle that we see happen throughout history. And so I think we should be critical of it, right? I mean, I think we should be critical of, are people hardworking or are people able to be worked hard, right? Like what is that? What does it mean to kind of take up the mantle of being hardworking? What does that category actually mean to us? Is that a thing that we want to sort of attach to Hispanicness and our identity? Yeah, Ruby.
I feel like Latino people, like throughout history, are only valued when they have a price tag on their back, and we like constantly hear this rhetoric about Latinos being hardworking, but there's just like no way to just exist in the United States being Latino without being a hard worker and be valued, which is like so, I guess, like tiring.
Yeah, Jackie.
It reminds me of like California and like the Great Depression, where it's like they were very much welcomed into the community. They were hard workers, but then once they stopped having a need for the labor, they were basically turned into villains who were just taking up the jobs, who were taking up the services, who were contributing negatively to the country and needed to be kicked out. So it's sort of the cycle of they're only welcomed when they're useful for labor, but otherwise they're very much almost like objects that can be kicked out and moved around however they please, not necessarily humans.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, Maria, please.
And when I was like doing the reading, I kept thinking about how like that narrative kind of worked against us in a way. Like the whole like hard worker thing also led to like those racial tensions, not just with white workers, but also African American workers, because we're constantly being like pitted against them. Like, oh, we're so much better because we're doing all this hard work. We're being exploited, really. Not that we're like hard workers. I think we're just easily exploitable.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? Can you say more about the sort of juxtaposition against Black workers and what you're getting at there?
Yeah, like when I was reading, a lot of like the carpet, the poultry like industries did not want to hire like Black or white workers because they felt that they were like complaining, they were demanding high wages, they were getting injured easily, as opposed to like Hispanic workers who were settling down for those wages. It was specifically like this one like line that said that the workers here, like the white and Black workers, were demanding $15 an hour, whereas Hispanic workers would settle down for like 12 and do it with no complaints.
Yeah. Do you want to add to that, Julie?
The idea of the hardworking Latino comes from like the anti-Black sentiment that was had, where Black workers or Black people were considered lazy, and that kind of like seeped into the Latino community, where they I wouldn't say take advantage, because at the end of the day we were exploited as well.
Yeah,
but
it's complicated.
The complicated history with like the anti-Black rhetoric, and it mentions it a lot in the article that we read. And I think like you can't talk about the idea of the hardworking Latino without recognizing the fact that it comes from an anti-Black place.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to comment on this? Yeah, Sebastian.
Kind of adding on to what Maria said, like a lot of like the anti-Latino sentiment came from like their tendency to take lower wages than, let's say, white and Black workers. And you can even see that today. A lot of the people are kind of blaming Latinos for wages being lower, and they're blaming them for being able to take those lower wages. So that contributes a lot to that.
Yeah. Yeah, Alexa.
Yeah, this is just a quick comment, but like just recently, Donald Trump, like when like things exploded in the news because he said that undocumented Latinos were taking Black jobs in America. So like that same rhetoric is being used today, and it works pretty effectively.
That's a great connection. Yeah, so let me bring some of these threads together, because there's a lot of really good stuff in this air right now. So I think part of it is, I want to start by thinking about what Ruby was having us think about, which is about the way that we how Latinos, both through historical narrative and contemporary activism, make claims about their value and their worth here in the United States, right? So part of the way that we as historians, right, we're very much a part of the problem. We talk about remarkable people. We talk about people who built businesses, who became politicians, who became remarkable human beings, right? And so you get this sense that the only way that Latinos are able to make a claim to the United States is through those kinds of accomplishments. And a lot of people don't. We've read some of that this semester, right? We read about defiant braceros that put bracero workers and laborers at the center. Ybor City put them at the center of the story, right? But also how contemporary activism, how we have to sort of think about how are we narrating why we deserve rights, right? We can think about it back to sort of like the articles that we've read about early Latino activism. What is our claim to civil rights, to labor rights, to human rights? And is it just our ability to be good workers and to be loyal and to be patriotic and to be family oriented, right? I think that's important. And to sort of connect that to what Maria and Julissa got us started thinking about, we're talking about the 1990s in the South. We're specifically in Georgia. I know you all probably, does Newt Gingrich mean anything to you all? Do you know this person? Yeah, that's tough for me to hear. Aging is cool. So, I mean, Newt Gingrich is one of the kind of architects of the rise of the right and the modern right, conservative movement. But we're really fresh off of like Reagan era economics and ideas about the welfare queen and this idea of welfare users as sort of lazy and that's a sort of a coded, a racially coded category, right? So he's being sort of critical of what he sees as Black communities' unwillingness to work, unwillingness to get off of government dependency. And, this is a narrative, right? We can be very critical of this. This isn't borne out statistically in terms of who are welfare users and things like that. Anyway. So we're sort of fresh off of that as a nation. And so this idea of Latinos, especially in the South, the idea of Latinos as hard workers is sort of it's a dense thing to say. It's like it's a gesture, I think, to the Black workers that they're sort of juxtaposing themselves against. Any other comments about this before we get to I was going to say to the sad part, but I guess this part hasn't been very inspiring. But it's like this sort of like post, when it goes downhill. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So, what changes? This is the sort of second chapter that you all read. So things start to change in the early 2000s. So a couple things happen. The first is 9/11. So terror attacks, 9/11. I think you all know what happened. I don't know. I'm like, do I have to do a rehearsal? I forget about how old you all are. There's a terror attack on 9/11, and it sort of sends the United States into chaos in all of these different ways. One of the important sort of things that happens after 9/11 is the really massive expansion of the surveillance state. One of the reasons, one of the concerns behind sort of like why did 9/11 happen was this idea that agencies weren't talking to each other, that local police, federal agencies weren't talking across both sort of like hierarchy and amongst each other. So there's a growing effort to collaborate, to share information, to be able to, if the FBI sees something, they need to be able to tell the DEA, who needs to be able to tell ATF, all of those, groups that you would hear on NCIS or like Law and Order, these different agencies needed to be able to talk to each other. And one of the things that happens as part of that is that those 287G programs that we talked a little bit about getting started with IRA, get really popular. So 287G programs, localities need to buy into the program. So they say, we want a 287G program here. It comes with a little bit of funding. It comes with training, things like that. So more and more states and localities buy into 287G programs. And of course, it's under the auspices of sort of terrorism management, reduction, prevention. That's the sort of goal behind it, but it has a lot of secondary effects. So some of the important things that happen, the 287G programs that are started with IRA become more popular at the same time that there's growing xenophobia and nativism, right? So in the wake of the terror attacks, there's a sense that foreigners are dangerous, this fear that by many white Americans, this fear that foreigners are dangerous, they're coming here to attack us, and we need to sort of prevent that. And Latinos are certainly not the main target of the kind of post 9/11 racial fears. Those are reserved for largely like Arab and Muslim people, but Latinos get kind of caught in the dragnet as a result. And so let me just give you a few examples of that from people in the South. Reverberations of 9/11 were felt in places like Dalton, Georgia. Carlos Noriega remembered, after 9/11, it got hard. It was more difficult for us as Latinos because they look at us as though we caused the 9/11 attacks. Since we Latinos are from outside the United States, they think that we are foreigners, that we foreigners are all the same, and that we are terrorists or something like that. One Guatemalan poultry worker in Mississippi said, quote, "We only come to work and we want to do it well. We don't want them to see us as criminals or as terrorists. We are the terrorists of the tomatoes, the oranges, the chickens, nothing more." Another man, Diego, who came to Winston-Salem from Guerrero, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, in 1999, reported that before 9/11, finding work was easy. But now, he said, after the attack on the Twin Towers, it's been a bit more difficult. With the war, they already had the rules to check on people more and more, then the raids, now the economy. So yes, it's a lot more difficult now. So after 9/11, there's a sense amongst Latinos that 9/11 is this turning point in their experience, that if they were seen as hardworking immigrants before, and it was easy to find a job, and it was easy to find a job specifically even if you were undocumented, 9/11 is a real turning point for them. And there's a sense, too, that the growing surveillance state, the growing police state is negatively impacting them. Yeah, Ruby.
I have a question about the 287G programs.
Sure.
So if the cities have to buy into the programs, does that mean that cities that don't buy into it are automatically sanctuary cities, or do they have to buy into that too?
No, yes, that's a good question about sanctuary cities. So 287G basically makes it so that local police officers can act as ICE officials, but a sanctuary city would suggest that ICE itself cannot operate within its sort of limits, right? Which is different. Those are sort of different categories. So this is kind of about expanding policing, and that is more about pushing policing out, which is to say that if you're not a sanctuary city and you're not in the 287G program, if ICE officials or if Border Patrol or something like that suspects that there's a large number of undocumented people, they can still go and do raids in things like factories or communities or things like that. So they can still do that, but local police aren't part of that action, basically.
But the sanctuary cities don't have to buy their protection the same way that in 287G, they have to buy that in to collaborate.
Well, I think sanctuary cities do in the sense that they declare themselves a sanctuary city, right? And so, a sanctuary city is sort of a decision on the part of local officials to make certain kinds of policing and detention not a part of their common practice, right? The same way that some localities say, this isn't our priority, we're not going to arrest people for these kinds of crimes, we're only going to focus on these other kinds of crimes. Sanctuary cities are making a choice about their sort of laws and how they enforce them. So it is similar, I guess, in the sense that they do have to buy in as a community. The 287G programs are more it just makes it so that local officials all of a sudden are much more powerful, right? Again, it's when you think about how many times, somewhere like here, right? One of the quotes that I remember about this is that the 287G programs makes every city a border city, right? Because if you think about it, it's how many border officials do you see on a random day in Durham, North Carolina? Probably not many. But how many cops do you see? A handful, depending on where and which communities you live, maybe even more than that, right? And so if all of those people all of a sudden become empowered to become border officials, basically, all of a sudden, the border has come to you, right? And so that's why these things become so important, which again, the 287G in the post 9/11 period, the goal isn't sort of explicitly to get undocumented people, but it ends up having that kind of effect, right, as a result. It's a great question. Other questions about this and sort of 9/11 moment? Okay. So I think Sebastian kind of got us started thinking about this already. But 2008, there's a sort of a global recession where the U.S. is particularly hard hit. It starts in the U.S. as a result of a bunch of complicated things, including subprime mortgages and things like that. So I think Jackie got us started thinking about this, but based on what we know as historians in this class, why would we maybe be concerned about what an economic recession might mean for this community? Like, what does that mean for this population? Yeah, Julissa.
Well, because kind of like how Jackie was saying, how Latinos were taking the jobs that no one else wanted. Now, in a recession, there's a need for these jobs to white Americans and to, other Americans. So in the recession, I think xenophobic ideologies came more about because now like the idea of us actually taking the jobs is coming alive because the jobs that now people need are taken by the Latinos. So
right. So did you want to add to that? Yeah.
During the Great Depression, even if people were citizens, they were still getting their jobs taken away simply because they were Hispanic. So it's not necessarily a citizenship type of thing. It's more of who are you and who's the real Americans that's jobs are being taken away. Because even though they were citizens, they weren't able to access a lot of resources that were available to white Americans, and their jobs were also being taken away to be given to white Americans.
Yeah. So this is the story of the Great Depression that we learned about in LA back in a few weeks ago, right? In general, economic downturn is bad for Latinos in general, immigrants as well. It's just, it's that kind of scapegoating that we saw in the 1920s. It kind of comes back in the recession. And part of what makes it so pernicious in this moment is what happened at 9/11. So we all of a sudden have a lot more resources being poured into our local police, poured into our borders, border patrol, things like that. And then we have the recession happen. So all of a sudden we have this massive apparatus that can be activated because of this growing nativism and xenophobia. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Because I just want to make sure that connects, where I'm all of a sudden the police have much more power, there's a lot more surveillance, all of these different things. And that negatively impacts Latinos, right? But then 2008 happens, and all of that technology becomes really powerful again against these communities. And so what happens after the Great Recession is we start to see the first waves of anti-immigrant legislation here in the Southeast. So starting in 2010, does anyone remember Arizona's SB 1070? This was kind of a big law back in the day. Okay, so 2010, Jan Brewer, the governor of Arizona, tries to get Arizona's SB 1070, or passes Arizona's SB 1070. It's sort of colloquially known amongst activists as the Show Me Your Papers law. It's a law that says if police suspect someone of being undocumented, they can stop them and ask to see their citizenship papers. And if they cannot produce those documents, they can be arrested. So you can think about what does it mean to suspect that someone is undocumented? What might this produce? Could this produce racial profiling? And this idea that you had to carry your papers with you at all times, right? Otherwise, you could be arrested and who knows what. And so that happens in 2010, and there's a lot of activism against that. It's a sort of a national moment. A lot of people are protesting, refusing to go to do performances in Arizona and things like that. Then the South shows up. The South is hold on, Arizona, we've got this. So 2010, we start to see Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, all starting to pass their own versions of this kind of legislation. So let's take HB 56. So that was in Alabama. Southern legislators passed the Beeson-Hammond Alabama Taxpayer and Citizen Protection Act. Beeson-Hammond Alabama Taxpayer and Citizen Protection Act, or HB 56, which was signed into law by Governor Robert J. Bentley on June 9th, 2011. HB 56 required police to detain any person that they have a reasonable suspicion is in the country unlawfully. It prohibited undocumented migrants from receiving any public benefits at either the state or local level. It prevented them from attending publicly owned colleges or universities. It required K through 12 schools to determine which students were in the country illegally. It prohibited landlords from renting properties to undocumented peoples. I need to end on the K-12 one. That's more punchy than the landlords one. Sorry, it's like and then the landlords. Anyway, the point is it makes it impossible to be an undocumented person in Alabama. And Alabama, you will remember, mucho trabajo in Russellville, Alabama. Remember that one? Right, these are the same people who are actively recruited by Alabama's industries, right? So just sort of keep mucho trabajo in Russellville always in your mind. So that's sort of what happens in the 2010s. North Carolina tries to pass a version of this of their own. Mississippi tries and fails as a result of activism by both Black and Latino legislators and community activists. Alabama passes one. Georgia passes one that's pretty famous because it also prevents students from, undocumented students from attending the top 5 public universities in Georgia, which is complicated. It's not complicated, it's bad. It's, because they also have this whole Hope Scholarship thing where, is anyone here from Georgia? I can't remember, no, we're more in North Carolina class. Okay, anyway, we can circle down that later. So at the same time that there's this spike in anti-immigrant legislation, the Latino communities that had been forming all this time were also pushing back against this, and they were eager to push back against this law. Actually, let me zoom back. Sorry, I forgot one thing to include. So one of the important things about this legislation in the 2010s was, you heard it in the Alabama language, was the focus on protecting the taxpayer. And this helps us think a little bit about, what does it mean to be hardworking? When are you hardworking and when you're not? When are you a contributor? When are you not? So part of the way that lawmakers legitimized these laws was to use language about their concern about the taxpayer and keeping jobs for Americans, again, sort of echoing some of what we've heard in other historical moments. South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, in her announcement of South Carolina's version of their 2010 era anti-immigrant legislation, said, quote, "What we're saying is this state can no longer afford to support people that don't come here the right way, and we are now going to do something about it." Nathan Deal, then governor of Georgia, said of the state's own law seeking to limit, quote, illegal immigration, HB 87, states must act to defend their taxpayers. In Mississippi, chairman of the Mississippi Federation for Immigration Reform and Enforcement, Rodney Hunt, who I could not find a photograph of, said illegal immigration eliminates a lot of jobs for people who want to provide for their families. Passing this bill will open up more jobs and lower unemployment for the state. I mean, a lot of these could be ripped right out of what we read about in Los Angeles, right? This is just almost word for word. Latinos also felt this shift. As Antonio, who came to North Carolina from Mexico in 2006, remembered, people that have been here even longer than I used to say that back in the 1990s, when someone saw a Hispanic, the first reaction was curiosity. The treatment was different. Hispanic now has a negative connotation. Hispanic is illegal, unauthorized, poor, nothing to offer to the society, criminal, gangster.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
20 years earlier, Latinos were celebrated as the new hardworking immigrants who were going to revitalize the South, and who in fact did revitalize much of Southern industry. They built the Atlanta Olympic stadiums. They rebuilt Katrina after the hurricane, they rebuilt New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. They did those things, right? And now they were being seen as illegals. They were seen as draining the city's state and city coffers. So for decades, these industries had created these elaborate recruitment schemes to bring Latinos, and specifically undocumented Latinos, here to the region. And now many of the state and local authorities were attempting to expel the very people who have been brought through those schemes and who had rejuvenated their local economies. Okay, so we have this wave of legislation, 2010s, through there. Latinos also push back, and that's important to know. Latinos are always pushing back against this legislation. On June 29th, 2010, just a few miles down the road in Raleigh, North Carolina, Rosario Lopez, Viridia Martinez concluded a 14-day hunger strike at the North Carolina Legislature building. Luis da Silva also participated in the hunger strike and had been taken to the hospital a week earlier in the week to be treated for dehydration and heat stroke. These 3 women had lived in central North Carolina since they were children, and they were members of the NC Dream Team. The women were hoping that their hunger strike would push Senator Kay Hagan, a Democrat here in North Carolina, to co-sponsor the DREAM Act, Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. Do people know the DREAM Act? What do people know about? What is the DREAM Act? What does it do? Melanie?
I'm not sure if I'm correct, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Is the DREAM Act sort of like Dreamers? Is it like Dreamers? So it helps those who were brought to the U.S. as like young children or as minors, and supports them here. I have family members who are Dreamers, but I'm not really well educated on like the exact definition. But yeah.
No, that was great though. The Dreamers are sort of similar to what we think of today as DACA. I mean, they're like related kinds of legislation. The goal is basically to create some kind of protection for people who were brought at a very young age to the country, right? Who the language is through no fault of their own were brought to the United States. And again, I think we can be sort of critical of that framing and what that means. But so the DREAM Act is sort of an important catalyzing thing that happens throughout the country, but here in the South, there's a lot of effort to try and get that passed. So they're protesting against that. 9 months later, Martinez and Jose Rico, another member of the NC Dream Team, traveled to Georgia to join undocumented students from across the country to protest Georgia's legislation that banned undocumented students from attending the top 5 public schools in the state. Rico described his reason for participating, quote, "Because there are all of these bills popping up in North Carolina, there is a ban in South Carolina. There is just around the country the same thing." Following a march through Atlanta, Rico and Martinez, along with 5 other students, donned graduation caps and blocked a street that stretched from the Georgia State University campus to the state capitol. As the students were arrested, crowds chanted, "No papers, no fear, no fear, immigrants are marching here, and education, not segregation." We're gonna watch a short clip of these activists.
And today I'm here to tell you that I'm done. I'm done of being afraid. I'm done of not knowing what's going to happen. I am done. Today I'm here to tell the world that I am undocumented, that I am here, and I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. Atlanta is under attack. What do we do? Stand up like that. I think that we're going to keep doing this until we stop seeing these attacks on our communities, until we have access to better education for all, regardless of immigration status.
And I hope that from this moment on, that more African Americans and more of those who are involved in the civil rights movement will begin to throw their arms around the issue of immigration. In my humble opinion, it is the civil rights issue of the 21st century.
The only thing that we have is ourselves. So we have to put ourselves out in the front lines and take direct action and show that we are undocumented and that we are unafraid. I think that's the only way we will get change.
So that woman at the end who was speaking in the last image, she's from Raleigh, North Carolina, and she was one of the folks who was involved in that hunger strike. Any reactions to the video or to these stories? Alondra? Oh, let's go. Can we go here first, Alondra? And then we'll go to Alexa. Yeah.
I just find it really strange how, like, when they, like, put their title cards, it says illegal immigrant in the bottom. I think that's a bit demeaning.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very reasonable. Yeah, Alexa, back there.
Yeah, so this topic is kind of what my final paper is about, but it's focused on North Carolina instead. And like when I was reading the chapter which talked about this, I was thinking about how little things have changed, like since the early 2000s, like when what the time period that we're learning about, because like in North Carolina, undocumented students can't get any state benefits, and like even if they have proof of residency, proof that they graduated high school in North Carolina, et cetera, they cannot get in-state tuition even for community college. So like for community colleges in North Carolina specifically, like the tuition charged for these undocumented students is essentially the same as what they would charge an international student going to this community college. So they're paying upwards of like $11,000, $12,000 a semester for community colleges in some cases, versus just $1,000 if they were an in-state, if they were considered an in-state resident, which the majority of them are. And then when that applies to just the universities in general, it's just crazy amounts of money. And part of my paper is looking at how a lot of undocumented students, like once they reach 11th grade in high school, either drop out or they just fail out or stop trying, because a lot of them get to that point and realize that like while their classmates are looking at colleges and planning their future, they are really restricted by these financial barriers to their education because of these laws.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for bringing that to the North Carolina context. I'm glad you're doing that for your project. Yeah, Sebastian.
What I thought was really interesting was that, like what you said about the Georgia law, that they can't attend the top 5 state universities. I feel like that kind of comments on how they wanted the Latino community to be. They wanted them to be kind of like a lower class, because they don't. They say, okay, you can go to university, but you can't go to the top 5 ones, because they don't want them to ascend in kind of the social rankings in a sense.
Dang. Some of the words, Sebastian. Yeah, that's really good. That's well put. Yeah, Maria.
Yeah, going off what Alexa was saying, it's happening here. It's also happening in Florida. Like just last year, so much legislation was passed for a governor that like affected not just schools. Like I have so many friends who are just like in general relatively undocumented or documented. As long as you don't have a green card, you cannot get in-state tuition at public universities in Florida. And even a lot of private universities will not give you the financial aid that they're willing to give to anyone else, even if out of state, in-state. Like they just treat us like completely different. Like I have a friend applying right now who's being processed as an international student despite of living in Florida for like most of her life. And going back to that, it's not just schools, but also like hospitals. Like in Florida, you have to show your papers in a hospital, which we just passed last year. So I feel like we're just going backwards, and a lot of things, like Alexa was saying, have not changed and have gotten worse, if anything.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason I wanted to talk today about thinking about this as in the context of like the 1980s and the 1990s is that if you sort of zoom in this in a random moment and you're like, oh, okay, like this seems, there's stuff going on here. There's these new laws that are being passed. Like what is this? But if we understand the longer history, if we understand the recruitment, if we understand how and why people end up here in the South, these laws have a different kind of meaning, actually, right? They are part of this cycle that Sebastian helped us think about, of the kind of invitation and expulsion cycle that continues to happen. And without understanding how and why Latinos arrive here, we can't understand why these laws are so damaging and so, sort of ahistorical, right? That this history helps us think differently about what these laws are doing. Any other comments? Yeah, please, Ashley.
I feel like the root causes of why they, like people from Mexico or just Latin America in general, why they needed to migrate because of things like NAFTA, I feel like that gets lost.
Yeah.
Because just like the recruitment, but like why did they need to come for work? Like just that whole history just gets lost in like all this hate. So like it's just like.
No, that's a great point. It's such a good point. There's an article that I sometimes teach for this class. It comes, it's from The Atlantic, and it follows the story of this one man who was in, I think it was Oaxaca, but he did like he raised hogs in Oaxaca. And because of free trade agreements, and because of the fact that, a variety of things, he has to move to North Carolina, where he does hog production, right? He works in factories that raise and then kill pigs, right? And so it's just this, the part of the article is like the right to not migrate is also something we don't talk enough about. That I think he would, he's saying, I would rather be in Oaxaca sort of doing the kind of thing I was doing, but because of these sort of global changes in the economy that I had no vote in, really, I now have to leave my life, leave the place that I was to do the same kind of work for less money in a place that I don't necessarily know or want to be, and where people are trying to constantly kick me out. And so it's this, I'm so glad you brought up that point. Any other last comments? Yeah, Caitlin.
This is on a more positive note, but I'm glad that in the video they mentioned how this is like the civil rights movement of the present, because it's showing how the Latino community can kind of relate to the African American community now, and how they're kind of forming solidarity with one another, and like the struggles that they're facing against, I guess, not being classified as like Americans by a lot of people.
Yeah, that's good. I do think, yeah, please, Nayeli.
I thought it was interesting too that they wore their high school like graduation caps, because it's like them trying to fight that stigma and like the propaganda that was at the time against like undocumented community, like the undocumented community, and like showing them, well, I went to school and I want to continue. Like this is, I want to be a productive person of society, and like we can contribute, but the laws are just limiting us. So,
yeah. Do you hear though how even in what you just said, like you can hear the hardworking thing come out? I mean, it's so complicated, right? I mean, and this is what's complicated about like the DREAM Act and a lot of the Dreamers is that like their argument is like, we want to go to school, we want to fight in the military, we want to do these things, like please give us access. And it's like, and I think you're absolutely correct, right? Like they do, like they just want to be seen as students and not as, a statistic or a criminal, right? They want to be seen as who they are and what they see themselves as. And it's like, but how do we decouple the value that someone has from what they can produce, right? Because the reality is that if you're born here in the United States, you don't have to prove to anyone that you're worthy of this citizenship. You can do whatever you want, like you can be you can be unproductive, you can do all these different things, but you still get to hold on to that. And so it's like, anyway, I totally hear you, and I think you're absolutely spot on. And it's like there's these interesting ways that, as far back as when we were talking about like LULAC, right? We're talking about fighting for Caucasian rights and what they were doing in Texas in the 1920s, right? The 1940s, I should say, that there's that kind of language of contribution, and it's worth thinking about sort of what does that get us and what does it not get us, right? What does it offer us as a strategy, and what are the limits of that strategy? Okay, last thing, just a couple takeaways from our conversation today, our lecture. The first is the importance of region. We started thinking a little bit about how history, how Miami, New York, LA, all these different places were evolving in the 1960s and 1970s. And what we can see is that things were unfolding pretty differently here in the South. That where and when you are Latino shapes what that category means. So the history of Latinos in a place like North Carolina, in the Southeast in general, follows a different timeline than some of these other Latino stories that we've told. And so, this has, I think, been a theme for this class, but there's not one Latino history, right? There's many Latino histories that are kind of existing side by side, and one of the ways that is shaped is around the question of region. The other important thing that I want us to leave with is this idea that Latinos were placemakers and are placemakers here in the South. The work that you all are doing, looking at the history of Latinos here in Durham, for example, are demonstrating the ways that Latinos are shaping Durham. They're shaped by this place, but they're also transforming it, which is to say the South is different because of the fact that Latinos are here. And that we have been and will continue to shape the region looking forward. Any final questions for today before we wrap up? Okay, cool. All right, guys. Well, I will see you all on a week from today, on Tuesday. On Thursday, you have your research day, so enjoy that. And I will see you then. All right.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find even more history content, visit our website at cspan.org.